The rejection wasn't supposed to hurt this much. That was the lie Lottie had been rehearsing since dawn. She stood at the center of the great hall of Ashenvale Keep, wearing the cream-colored dress her mother had embroidered by hand 15 years before she died. Tiny silver wolves stitched along the hem, patient and intricate, each one a small prayer. The hall smelled of pine resin and candle wax, and the faint sweetness of the mead being poured in the antechambers. Torchlight made everything gold. Banners of the Ashenvale Pack hung from the raftered ceiling, deep green and black, and 300 people had gathered beneath them to witness what was supposed to be the most sacred declaration a wolf could make. A mating ceremony. Her mating ceremony. Lottie had known Cole Ashenvale since she was 12 years old. She had grown up watching him train in the yard below her window, had braided wildflowers into crowns she never showed anyone, had written his name once in the margin of a prayer book, and then spent an hour rubbing it out with a damp cloth. When his father and hers had arranged the match 5 years ago, she had told herself the warmth she felt was gratitude. By the time she was 22, she had decided it was love. It had felt close enough. She had sewn herself into believing it. Now she was 24, standing at the altar stone with 300 wolves watching. And Cole Ashenvale had not moved from the far end of the hall for 4 minutes. 4 minutes was a long time to stand still in front of everyone you had ever known. The elder was still holding the binding cord, the dark red ribbon that was supposed to wrap around their joined wrists. His hands had gone stiff. He didn't look at Lottie. Nobody did, except the ones who couldn't stop. Those were the worst, the ones with pity already shaped behind their eyes, waiting. Cole finally walked forward. For one absurd, aching moment, Lottie's chest filled with relief. She nearly exhaled. She nearly smiled. She had spent so long needing things to be all right that she had trained herself to see rescue in every approach. He stopped 6 feet away. "I cannot complete this bond," Cole said. His voice was steady, practiced. He had rehearsed this. "Not with you." The hall did not gasp. It went the worst kind of quiet, the held kind, where everyone breathes in and no one lets go. Lottie did not move. Her hands were cold. The embroidered hem of her mother's dress touched the stone floor. "I have known for some time," Cole continued, and now he was looking somewhere past her left shoulder, the way people look when they cannot meet your eyes and have decided that looking away is mercy, that my wolf does not recognize you as my mate. I have waited, believing it would change. It has not, and I will not bind myself to someone the bond does not confirm. There was a sound from the left side of the hall, a small sound, almost nothing. Lottie turned her head without meaning to, and saw her. Petra. Dark-haired, pink-cheeked Petra, who had been her handmaiden for 2 years, who knew the silver wolves on the hem of this dress, who had helped her pin her hair this morning with careful, familiar hands. Petra was crying. Not from sadness. She was standing 3 rows back with her fingers pressed to her mouth, and the tears on her face were the kind that come from something too large to contain. The kind that come from relief. From joy, barely held. Lottie understood everything in the space of a single breath. Not just that Cole was rejecting her. That part she was still assembling, still pressing into the shape of something survivable. The worst thing, the thing that cracked something open below her ribs, was that Petra already knew. Had known before Lottie walked into this hall in her mother's dress. Had helped her pin her hair, and had said nothing. "The ceremony is concluded," Cole said, to the elder, not to her. Lottie turned back to face him. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than she expected. "You could have told me before I walked in here." Cole's jaw moved. "I thought the setting would make the reasoning clearer, that this was about the bond, not about you." "The setting," she repeated. 300 people, torchlight, her mother's dress, the binding cord hanging limp from the elder's fist. She did not cry. She was not sure why, perhaps because the cold that had settled into her hands had moved upward and reached the part of her where tears were stored. Or perhaps because some deep animal part of her understood that weeping here, in front of all of them, would cost her something she could not afford to lose. She took one step back from the altar stone, then another. Her heels found the edge of the carpet runner, and she registered faintly the sound of her own breathing, shallow and very controlled. The whispers had started. She could feel them more than hear them, the way you feel weather changing in your joints before the sky shows it. She was almost to the door when the second thing happened. The doors of Ashenvale Keep opened. Not with urgency, not with violence. They opened the way doors open for people who have never been required to knock. Steadily, completely, as though the wood itself agreed this was necessary. The man who entered was tall enough that the torchlight caught him differently, the shadows reorganizing around him rather than falling on him the ordinary way. He was dressed in dark riding clothes, a long coat of charcoal wool with no embellishment, except the silver clasp at the collar, the clasp of the Lycan court, a crescent bisected by a blade. His hair was dark, his face lean and angular, and his eyes swept the hall with the particular quality of someone who assesses a room not for threat, but for information. 3 men came behind him. Not guards in the performative sense. These were warriors who had long since stopped needing to look like warriors. The whispers in the hall did not grow louder. They stopped. Cole had gone very still. The elder dropped the binding cord. Lottie had not moved from the doorway. She stood at the exact point where the ceremony's failure met this new and incomprehensible arrival, and she became, for a moment, invisible to the room, because every eye had shifted to the man who walked toward the altar, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had already decided what he was about to do. He stopped at the altar stone. He looked at the elder. Then, slowly, he looked at Cole. Alpha Ashenvale. His voice was low and even, not loud. It didn't need to be loud. It was the kind of voice that organized air around it. I received your invitation to witness this ceremony. Cole's throat moved. My Lord Dominic, yes. We were not informed of your arrival time. I arrived, Dominic said simply, at the time I chose. He turned then, and his gaze moved across the hall with that same steady, information-gathering quality. And when it reached the doorway, it stopped. It stopped on Lottie. She did not know what her face was doing. She suspected it was doing very little, because she had spent the last 6 minutes holding herself together with nothing but her own stillness, and she had run out of the ability to perform anything beyond that. He looked at her for a long moment. Not with pity. Not with the bright, uncomfortable sympathy that had been aimed at her from every other direction in this hall. He looked at her the way you look at something that requires your full attention, careful and completely present. Then he walked toward her. The hall remained silent in a way that felt less like quiet and more like collective breath suspension. He stopped 4 feet away. His eyes were gray, she noticed, not the warm gray of overcast mornings, but the deeper gray of stone that has been wet for a long time. He was older than Cole. Older than most of the men in this room. Not elderly. Perhaps 35, perhaps more. But the kind of age that sat in the set of the jaw and the economy of movement, rather than in the face itself. He did not lower his voice. I would speak with you, Dominic said to Lottie, in front of everyone who had just watched her be discarded. If you are willing. Lottie's heart was still doing something ungovernable inside her chest. Her hands were still cold. The embroidered wolves along her hem touched the stone floor. About what? She said. It was not quite a question. She was too wrung out for inflection. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, the suggestion of recognition, perhaps, as though her directness had confirmed something he'd already suspected. An offer, he said. One I believe is worth your time. Behind him, Cole Ashenvale had gone the color of ash. Lottie looked at the man in front of her. This stranger, this Lycan King who had walked into the ruins of her mourning and spoken to her as though she were someone worth addressing. And she thought, with the last clear corner of her mind that hadn't gone numb, whatever he is about to say, it cannot be worse than what just happened. She lifted her chin. Then speak. Dominic did not speak in the hall. He had gestured, a small, precise motion toward the corridor beyond the eastern arch. And somehow that gesture had been enough. Not a command, an offer, as he had said. The difference mattered, though Lottie could not have explained why it mattered to her in that particular moment, when everything else had stopped making sense. She followed him because the alternative was standing in the center of 300 pairs of eyes wearing her mother's dress, and she had already given that room everything she intended to give it. The corridor was narrow and smelled of cold stone, and the faint ghost of torches that had burned down hours ago. Their footsteps did not match in rhythm. His were longer, steadier, and hers were still carrying the slight unevenness of someone who had not quite caught their breath. One of his men fell into position at the far end of the hall behind them. The other two remained at the door. No one spoke. Dominic stopped at a window alcove halfway down the corridor. Outside, the morning sky was white with cloud, and the courtyard below held a line of horses still steaming from the road, their breath rising in pale threads. He had ridden hard to arrive here. She filed that away without knowing why. He turned to face her. In the corridor's dimmer light, the silver clasp at his collar caught the gray from the window, and she could see his face more clearly now, the faint line of an old scar along his left jaw, the way his attention settled on her without the restlessness she was accustomed to seeing in powerful men. Most alphas scanned rooms. He had already finished scanning. He simply looked. "You are Lottie Varn," he said. "Daughter of the late Aldrich Varn of the Eastern Reaches." Her father's name in a stranger's mouth felt strange and precise, like a key turned in a lock she hadn't known was there. "I am. Your father held the Varn territory under the old compact. 16 villages, 3 river crossings, the forest passage that runs between the Reaches and the northern trade road." He said it the way someone recites something they have known for a long time. When he died, that territory passed to his brother, your Uncle Gregor, under the condition that you were properly matched within your pack within 3 years of your 21st year. Lottie's chest tightened. "I am aware of the terms of my father's will." "Then you are also aware," Dominic said with the same evenness, "that what occurred in that hall this morning means those 3 years have now expired. The match was not completed. Under the compact, the territory reverts, not to you, but to the Crown directly, unless a new arrangement is formalized within 30 days. She knew this. She had known it in some distant theoretical way, the way you know that a cliff exists without letting yourself stand at its edge. She had believed the ceremony would happen. She had spent 2 years believing that. "You've come to claim the territory," she said. Her voice was flat. "That is the offer." "No." He said it without impatience, but with a firmness that closed the door on that interpretation. "I have come because I was already traveling to Ashenvale on a separate matter, and because 3 days ago my council received information about your situation that I considered relevant to a decision I had already been considering." "What decision?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of hesitation, the quiet of a man who chooses his words the way a blacksmith chooses his tools, deliberately, without waste. "I have ruled the Lycan court for 11 years, he said. "In that time, I have had no queen. Not from lack of arrangement. There have been arrangements. None of them were the right ones, and I ended them before they became the wrong kind of permanent." His gaze did not move from her face. "I am not a young man who mistakes convenience for compatibility. But I am also not a man who can rule a court of this complexity indefinitely, without a partner who carries weight. Lottie stared at him. You are proposing marriage. I am proposing a consideration of marriage. There is a difference. To me. To you. She turned away from him and looked at the courtyard below, at his horses, at the gray sky. Her hands had found each other in front of her dress. Not wringing, just holding. The way you hold something fragile to keep it from falling. I was rejected, she said, 11 minutes ago, in front of my entire pack, in my mother's dress. She paused. And you are standing in a corridor offering to marry me. Yes. Why? The word came out with more rawness than she intended. She didn't take it back. Why me specifically? There are daughters of alphas across 6 kingdoms who have not just been publicly humiliated. Why would the Lycan King walk into that hall and... Because your father was an honorable man who was owed a debt this court never repaid. The words were quiet and very direct. Because the territory he built should not be absorbed into a crown, holding because his daughter was failed by the pack that was supposed to protect her. And because... He paused, a fraction of a second. What I observed in that hall this morning was not a woman who had been broken. It was a woman holding herself together by will alone, and choosing not to weep in front of people who did not deserve her tears. Lottie's throat closed. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the courtyard below, on the horses, on the pale sky, and she breathed through the tightening in her chest with the focused care of someone diffusing something. That is not, she said carefully, a foundation for marriage. It is a foundation for respect, he said, which is more than most marriages begin with. She turned back to him then. He had not moved, had not shifted his weight, or crossed his arms, or done any of the things men did when they were waiting for an answer and growing uncertain of it. He simply stood, hands loose at his sides, watching her with that gray, unreadable steadiness. She studied his face, the scar on his jaw, the way his shoulders carried command without performing it. What would this marriage require of me? She asked. Presence at court, participation in certain councils, willingness to be seen as a partner in the governance of the Lycan territory. He paused. Nothing beyond what you would choose. And my father's land? Would be restored to your name, held in your right, not transferred. The 16 villages, the river crossings, the forest passage, yours. Administered under the compact, protected under the court's authority. Something shifted in her chest. Not warmth, not yet, not anything as accessible as warmth, but movement, the sense of something that had been sealed beginning, very slightly, to unseal. I would need time to consider it, she said. You have until we depart Ashenvale. My men and I will remain one night. That is not much time. No, he agreed. It is not. She looked at him for another moment. This man who had walked into the worst hour of her life and spoken to her as though she were not diminished by it. Why did you not simply send a letter? She asked. He considered the question with the same seriousness he seemed to give everything. Because letters can be intercepted, and because some offers should be made in person, so that the person receiving them can look at the man making them and decide whether he means what he says. She held his gaze. Do you? She asked. Mean it? I have not, he said. Said a single thing today that I did not mean. Lottie looked down at the silver wolves along her hem, her mother's careful stitching, each small wolf patient and permanent. She had come into this morning expecting to leave it bonded to a man who had spent 2 years practicing how to discard her. She was leaving it in a corridor with a stranger who had not yet looked away. She did not say yes. She was not ready to say yes. Too much of her was still standing at the altar stone, still absorbing the quality of Petra's tears, still feeling the stone floor through the thin soles of her ceremonial shoes. But she did not say no. One night, she said. Dominic inclined his head, the slight, formal acknowledgement of someone who had heard exactly what was said and intended to honor it precisely. She turned and walked back toward the hall. Her steps were steadier now. Not because anything had been resolved, but because she had something to carry that was not only grief, a question, a possibility, an offer that was either the strangest mercy she had ever been shown or something else entirely. She had not decided which. Behind her, she heard no footsteps. He did not follow. He remained at the window alcove in the gray corridor, and she understood without being told that he was a man who waited where he said he would wait. That, too, she filed away. A estalagem que Dominic havia requisitado para sua comitiva ficava na parte baixa da vila de Ashen Vale, afastada do castelo principal, por uma rua de pedras irregulares e uma fileira de carvalhos que haviam perdido metade das folhas para o vento de outono. Lottie foi até lá sozinha, na manhã seguinte, antes que o sol tivesse subido o suficiente para queimar o orvalho dos telhados. She had not slept. She had sat at the edge of her narrow bed in the guest chamber they had moved her to. She had been relocated from the betrothed suite the previous afternoon, quietly, without ceremony, which was somehow a smaller cruelty layered inside the larger one. And she had spent the hours of darkness working through what she knew, and what she suspected, and the considerable gap between those two things. What she knew. Cole had rejected her publicly. Deliberately, in the most formal setting available. The word deliberate mattered. A man uncertain of his decision did not rehearse it. He did not choose a hall of 300 witnesses. He did not stand 6 feet away with his chin level and his voice even, and speak of the bond as though the bond were a document requiring authentication. What she suspected. Petra. She had not been able to stop returning to that image. Petra's fingers pressed to her mouth, the tears on her cheeks that were not grief. The relief in them. Petra had been given to Lottie as a handmaiden 2 years ago, shortly after the match with Cole had been formalized. She had been warm and capable, and Lottie had trusted her with the mundane intimacies of daily life. Her appointments, her correspondence, the small vulnerabilities that accumulate when you allow someone into the rhythm of your mornings. And Petra had known what was going to happen in that hall, which meant someone had told her, which meant Cole had told her, which meant whatever existed between Cole and Petra was not new. Lottie had sat with that knowledge in the dark, and felt it settle into her bones the way cold settles. Not dramatic, just thorough, until every part of her had the same temperature. By dawn, she had made her decision. The Estalagem's common room was empty at this hour, except for a boy banking the fire, and one of Dominic's men seated near the door with a cup of something steaming. The man looked up when she entered. Assessed, did not move. "I need to speak with him," Lottie said. The man studied her for a moment, then rose without comment and disappeared up the narrow stairs at the back of the room. She waited by the fire. The wood the boy had added was green, and it hissed and spat before catching. She held her hands toward it, and noticed they were steadier this morning than they had been yesterday. Not because the pain had lessened, because she had made a decision, and decisions, even frightening ones, had a stabilizing quality that uncertainty did not. Dominic came down the stairs 5 minutes later. He was in plainer dress than the day before, a dark linen shirt, riding trousers, boots that carried the dust of the road not yet beaten out. He had clearly been awake already. He carried no sword at this hour, which made him look, she thought, neither smaller nor larger, simply differently arranged. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at her. "You've decided," he said. Not a question. "I have conditions," she said. He moved to the table nearest the fire and sat, not with any sense of claiming dominance over the space, but with the practicality of a man who intended to listen carefully and preferred not to do it standing. He gestured toward the chair across from him. She sat. "My father's territory," she began. "I want it restored before any ceremony takes place. Not promised. Documented, under the court seal, with a copy held by a neutral elder of my choosing. Agreed. She had expected negotiation. His immediacy threw her slightly, and she recalibrated. I want access to my father's records, all of them. I have reason to believe my Uncle Gregor has not administered the territory honestly since my father's death, and I want the right to investigate that without obstruction. Something in Dominic's expression sharpened, not surprise, but focused attention. What reason? My father left specific provisions for the village near the northern river crossing. A portion of the harvest tax was to be remitted to the village families directly, bypassing the administrative account. I have not been able to confirm those remittances occurred in 3 years. She kept her voice even. My father was precise about his accounts. If those funds did not reach those families, they went somewhere. I want to know where. Dominic was quiet for a moment. This was not a condition I anticipated. I'm aware. It is also, he said carefully, a condition that, if the investigation produces what you suspect it might, would mean moving against a sitting territorial administrator. I know. That is not a small action. No, she agreed. It is not, but it is a just one. He looked at her across the table with that gray, steady quality she was beginning to recognize as his default mode. Not coldness, but a kind of concentrated presence, as though he was giving her the full weight of his attention and intended her to feel it. Those remittances, he said. How do you know about them? My father told me about them himself, 3 months before he died. He was careful about that particular provision, because the families near the northern crossing had sheltered him during the sickness that took his first 2 horses in the bad winter 20 years ago. He never forgot a debt. She paused. Neither do I. The fire behind her had found the dry wood beneath the green and was burning steadily now, filling the room with the smell of oak smoke and warmth. Dominic said, I will grant access to the records, and if the investigation reveals misappropriation, the court will act. He held her gaze. What else? I want to bring one person with me to court. She said it carefully. A woman named Etta. She was my father's head housekeeper for 20 years. She is older, and she does not travel easily, but she is the only person in my current sphere whom I trust without reservation. Her voice did not waver on the last sentence, though it cost her something to say it. I will not go to an unfamiliar court without one person I know. She will be accommodated. Lottie looked at him. You agree to everything very quickly. Your conditions are reasonable, he said. I would be suspicious of a man who argued against them. She was quiet for a moment, turning that over. Then, I have one more. Yes. I will not be displayed. Paraded before your court as a replacement arrangement, a convenient solution, a territorial acquisition dressed in wedding clothes. Her chin lifted slightly. If we do this, I am introduced as your chosen companion, not your political solution. Something changed in his expression. Not dramatically, but she caught it. A warmth, brief and controlled, moving through the gray steadiness like light through stone. That, he said, was never the intention. I needed to say it. I know, he said, and I needed to hear it, so we are both better informed. Lottie looked at the fire for a moment, then back at him. He had not shifted, had not drummed his fingers on the table, or leaned back with the comfortable authority of a man who had already won. He sat as he stood, without performance, without the anxious energy of someone waiting for validation. Why did your previous arrangements end? She asked. It was not one of her conditions. It came from somewhere else, somewhere less strategic. He did not look away. The first was arranged by my father before his death. The woman was suitable in every measurable way and wanted nothing to do with the court, the life, or me. I ended it because a marriage to someone who endures you is worse than no marriage. A brief pause. The second was my own choosing. She was intelligent and I respected her. But she was in love with someone else and too honorable to say so, and I was paying enough attention to see it. I ended it before it became unkind. Lottie absorbed this. You have ended 2 arrangements out of consideration for the women involved. I have ended 2 arrangements because I am not interested in holding someone in place who wishes to be elsewhere. She looked at him for a long moment. I am not in love with you, she said. I want to be honest about that. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to be. I am also. She stopped, recalibrated, continued. I am not entirely unbroken. From yesterday, from before yesterday. I do not know how long it will take me to. She did not finish the sentence. I am not in a hurry, he said. Quietly, precisely, as though each word were load-bearing. Lottie looked at her hands in her lap, the embroidered wolves on her hem, her mother's careful stitching. All right, she said. She looked up at him. Then yes. Dominic held her gaze for a moment before he nodded. The same slight formal acknowledgement as the day before, but with something different underneath it now. Something that was not triumph. Something quieter than that. Outside the Estelagium window, the autumn light had broken through the clouds at last, pale and thin but present, laying itself across the uneven cobblestones of the street below. Lottie rose from the chair. He rose as well, immediately, without the half-second delay that men used to indicate they were doing her a favor. I will need until midday to gather my things, she said. We depart at midday, he said. She moved toward the door. Behind her, she heard him call for his man in a low, even voice, giving instructions, she gathered, for her departure to be arranged, for a horse to be readied, for Etta to be located and brought into the traveling party. He had already begun. She stepped out into the pale autumn morning and walked back up the cobbled street toward the keep, and she thought about her father, who had sheltered families in bad winters and written their names into his will to make sure they were not forgotten. She thought about what had been taken from those families, if her suspicions were right. She thought about the look on Petra's face. She was not done with Ashenvale yet, not by a long measure, but she was leaving it. The Lycan court sat at the crown of a long granite ridge, and the first time Lottie saw it from the road below, she thought it looked less like a castle, and more like something the mountain had decided to become. It was not beautiful the way Ashenvale Keep was beautiful, with its decorative banners and its manicured inner gardens, and its carefully maintained sense of noble comfort. The court was older than that, built from dark stone that had been quarried from the ridge itself, so that the walls seemed continuous with the rock beneath them, the same gray-black as the cliff face, the same texture, the same permanence. Towers rose at irregular intervals, not for symmetry, but for function. Watch positions, she understood, placed where sight lines demanded them. The whole structure gave the impression of something that had never needed to impress anyone, because it had never been in danger of being dismissed. Etta, seated beside her in the covered wagon, looked out at it for a long moment. Well, the older woman said, in her particular dry way, that had not changed in the 20 years Lottie had known her. It is certainly a great deal of stone. Lottie almost smiled. Almost. The journey from Ashenvale had taken 4 days. Dominic had ridden ahead for most of it, ranging with 2 of his men, appearing at camp in the evenings with the unhurried quality of someone returning from routine, rather than urgency. He had not crowded her. At meals he sat within conversational distance and spoke when she spoke, and was silent when she was silent, and she had found by the 3rd evening that his silence was a different kind than the silences she was accustomed to, not withholding, not pointed, not waiting for her to fill it with something more palatable. It was simply the silence of a man comfortable enough in himself to not require constant noise. On the 2nd night, when the camp was quiet and Etta had retired, Lottie had sat by the fire longer than was practical, and Dominic had remained also, and they had talked, carefully at first, and then with a gradual ease she had not expected, about her father, about the Northern Territories, about the compact that had governed the Reaches for 3 generations. He knew the history better than she had anticipated. He asked questions that were specific enough to tell her he had read the records before this conversation, not as preparation for negotiation, but from what seemed like genuine interest. She had not known what to do with that. She had filed it away with the other things about him that didn't fit the shape she had expected him to have. Now, as the wagon climbed the last road toward the court's outer gate, she sat with her hands folded in her lap and thought about what she was walking into. She did not have long to think. The gates opened, iron and oak, reinforced with the same dark stone, and they entered a yard that smelled of horses and forge smoke, and somewhere, faintly of bread. Life, in other words. The industry of a place that did not stop when its lord was away. A woman was waiting at the inner door. Tall, sharp-featured, perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair pinned back under a dark cloth, and the bearing of someone who had administered a large household for a very long time, and had no intention of being impressed by anything related to its current change in circumstance. She looked at Lottie with eyes the color of rain-washed slate and said, "I am Marin. I oversee the household. Your chambers have been prepared. I will take you there directly, unless you require food first." "Chambers," Lottie said. "Plural. A sitting room and a sleeping chamber, and a smaller room for your—" Marin looked at Etta with the assessing quality of someone categorizing a new variable. "Companion." "Housekeeper," Etta said pleasantly. "And I will want to see the kitchens before nightfall." Marin's expression did not change, but something in it reorganized slightly. "I will arrange that." The chambers were on the eastern side of the court's upper level, reached by a staircase of dark stone that curved upward through a tower and emerged into a corridor lit by iron sconces holding wax candles. Real wax, not tallow, which meant something about how seriously these rooms had been prepared. The sitting room had a fireplace already burning, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of books, and a window that looked east toward a hillside of pine forest, deep green and fog-edged in the afternoon light. The sleeping chamber beyond it held a bed with dark wood posts and linens that smelled of lavender, and the cedar of a chest recently opened. Someone had put a small vase of late-season wildflowers on the windowsill. Lottie stood in the middle of the sitting room for a moment, looking at all of it. "He prepared this before he left for Ashenvale," Etta said quietly from the doorway. It was not a question. "It appears so," Lottie said. She did not say anything else about it. But she stood there for another moment before she removed her traveling cloak. The first week at the Lycan court was an education in paying attention. She learned the rhythms of the place, the morning council that Dominic held in the long chamber off the main hall, the afternoon hours when the outer yard filled with training, the evening meals that were formal in structure but not in atmosphere, attended by council members and senior warriors, and occasionally visitors whose business brought them to the ridge. She was introduced at those meals as Dominic's chosen companion, as she had asked, and the members of his court received this information with varying degrees of visible adjustment, none of it hostile, most of it measured. She learned that his second, a compact, watchful man named Aldrich, she had startled at the name before remembering that her father's name had not been his alone, had served the court for 14 years, and trusted Dominic with the specific quality of trust that came from long observation rather than obligation. She learned that the court's healer, a woman called Sina, was the only person in the building who appeared completely unbothered by rank and spoke to everyone, including Dominic, with the same brisk directness. She learned that Dominic woke before dawn, and that one of those dawns, when sleeplessness drove her to the sitting room window, she had seen him in the yard below. Not training in the performative sense, but moving through a slow, deliberate sequence alone in the gray pre-light. The way someone moves through something they have done so many times it has become interior. She had watched for longer than she intended, and then turned away from the window before he could look up. She learned slowly that the thing she had identified on the road as his silence was actually a form of attention, that he noticed what she did not say as clearly as what she said, and that he responded to both with equal care. On the 8th day, he came to find her in the sitting room in the late afternoon, when the pine forest outside the window had gone dark blue with the dropping light. "I have received the records from the Varn territory," he said, and set a leather satchel on the table between them. Lottie was on her feet before he had finished the sentence. The records were dense. Administrative accounts, harvest tallies, tax records spanning 3 years of her Uncle Gregor's stewardship. She and Dominic spread them across the table, and she worked through them with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting for this and had no intention of being gentle about it. It took her 2 hours. The Northern River crossing families had received nothing. Not a partial remittance, not a delayed one. 3 years of her father's specific provision, carefully written into his will by a man who did not forget debts, had been redirected in the records to a secondary account notation that, when she traced it, corresponded to expenditures on, she paused, read it again, improvements to Gregor's own estate in the Southern Holding. Her father's debt of gratitude had been turned into her uncle's renovation fund. She sat back in her chair and put her hands flat on the table. Dominic had been reading alongside her, following the figures in his own methodical way, and he was quiet for a moment after she stopped. "The notation in the 3rd year," he said. "The account transfer marked as administrative consolidation. That is not a clerical error." "No," she said. "It is not." "It is fraud." "Yes." He looked at her. She was looking at the records with an expression she could feel on her own face. Not tearful, not shocked. Something older than shock. Something that had been waiting to be confirmed. "My father trusted him," she said. "Gregor was his younger brother. He trusted him with the land and with the provision and with—" She stopped. "With you," Dominic said quietly. "With your future, under the compact." She looked up. "The match with Cole Ashenvale," he said carefully. "Who arranged it?" The cold that had lived in her hands since the ceremony moved upward through her chest again, slow and comprehensive. "Gregor," she said. "And the Ashenvale pack holds a trade agreement with your uncle's southern estate," Dominic said. He reached into the satchel and produced a second document, shorter, folded, bearing a seal she recognized as Ashenvale's. "This arrived with the records. My man in the Eastern Territories collected it from the same courier." She unfolded it. It was a letter. In Cole's handwriting. She knew his handwriting from 2 years of formal correspondence. The slightly forward lean of his letters, the way he wrote the capital A. It was addressed to Gregor. It was dated 14 months ago. It confirmed an agreement. Cole would complete the mating ceremony with Lottie to satisfy the compact terms and prevent the territory from reverting to the crown. In exchange, Gregor would continue directing the northern remittances to the shared account. The letter used the phrase "managed conclusion" to describe what was apparently always the intended outcome: a completed ceremony, a transferred territory, and Lottie relocated to Ashenvale where she would be too far from the northern records to investigate them. The rejection in the hall had not been the plan failing. It had been the plan changing. She read the letter twice. The sitting room fire had burned low without either of them noticing, and the room had gone cold in the gradual way of rooms that lose their heat while their occupants are too absorbed to tend them. "They intended to use the ceremony to bind the territory," she said, "and then dispose of me through the marriage. Relocated, contained, her access to records managed by a husband who was party to the fraud. That is what the letter indicates. And the rejection. I do not yet know why the plan changed. Whether Cole developed reluctance, or whether Gregor decided a public rejection served a different purpose." He paused. "But we will find out." Lottie set the letter down on the table. She looked at it for a long moment. Cole's handwriting, her uncle's seal, her father's provision turned into a transaction between men who had decided she was a variable to be managed, rather than a person to be considered. She thought of the families near the northern river crossing. 3 winters of provisions that never came. Her father's face, telling her about those families, about the bad winter, about the debt he intended to honor. His voice had been careful and proud about it in a way that had nothing to do with status. She was not going to let that stand. "I want to go to the northern villages," she said, "before any formal action is taken against Gregor. I want to see the families myself and confirm what the records show." Dominic did not hesitate. "I will arrange an escort. I would rather you came." The words were out before she had decided to say them. She did not take them back. He looked at her across the table, across the spread of damning records, in the cold and dying light of the sitting room. "Then I will come," he said. The road to the northern river crossing took 2 days. They rode with a small party: Dominic, his second Aldrich, 2 warriors, Lottie and Etta, who had refused to be left behind with a firmness that had not invited discussion. The forest through the reaches was dense and old, pine and oak interlocked overhead, so that the light came through in narrow columns, pale and specific, illuminating small sections of the road and leaving the rest in a blue-green shadow that smelled of wet earth and resin and the cold particular to places the sun only visits briefly. Lottie rode without speaking for most of the first day. Dominic rode beside her and did not require her to fill the silence. This was, she had come to understand, one of his most consistent qualities. He never demanded anything of her emotional register. He accepted whatever she brought to a given moment without correction or redirection, which was so unlike every other arrangement she had been part of that she still, after more than a week, caught herself waiting for the adjustment that never came. On the evening of the first day, they made camp at the edge of the tree line, where the forest opened briefly onto a stretch of meadow grass, brown and frost-edged at this time of year. Etta produced a small pot of dried herbs from her traveling pack and made something hot and bitter that she pressed into Lottie's hands without comment. Lottie drank it by the fire and watched the dark line of the trees and thought about her father. He had traveled this road. He had known these forests by name, had spoken of the northern crossing families with the specific affection of someone who held a memory attached to a place. She had been 8 years old when he told her about the bad winter, about the shelter those families had offered. She had not understood yet, at 8, what it meant to be sheltered. She was beginning to understand it now. "He would have been angry," she said, to no one in particular, and then realized Dominic was sitting close enough to hear her. He looked at her across the fire. "My father," she said, "about what Gregor did. He would have been not loud about it. He was never loud. But he would have been the kind of angry that doesn't leave." She paused. "The kind that makes you very precise." "That kind of anger is useful," Dominic said. "It is what I have right now." He nodded slowly. "I know." She looked at him. In the firelight, his face was less composed than it was in the court, not unguarded exactly, but softer at the edges in the way faces become when the performances of the day have been set down. The scar along his jaw caught the light. She had stopped noticing it as an anomaly, and had started noticing it simply as part of his face, the way you stop seeing a scar on someone familiar. "Were you ever betrayed?" she asked. "By someone you trusted?" He was quiet for a moment. "My father's senior counsel," he said, "spent the last year of his reign diverting military resources to their own holdings. When I took the court at 24, I discovered that 3 border villages had been left without garrison protection because those resources had been redirected." He paused. "2 of those villages were raided in the Gap. What did you do?" "I removed the council members from their positions and stripped their holdings. Then I rebuilt the garrisons." His voice did not carry heat on any of it. just the even accounting of someone who had done what needed doing. And I made sure I knew every person in my council's name before I gave them anything worth taking. Lottie looked at the fire. Did it help? Doing something about it? It did not undo what happened, he said. But yes, it helped. She turned that over in her mind and kept it. The village nearest the northern river crossing was called Fenmore, and it was smaller than she had imagined. Perhaps 40 families, stone cottages with thatched roofs, a mill on the river that had seen better decades, a central well around which 3 children were playing a game, involving a length of rope and complicated rules that they appeared to be improvising as they went. The village elder was a woman in her 60s named Bess, broad-shouldered, with weathered hands, and the particular quality of dignity that belonged to people who had maintained it through difficulty, rather than inherited it through comfort. She looked at Lottie with careful eyes when Aldrich made the introduction, and then she looked at Dominic with the specific assessment of someone who had learned not to trust rank at face value. "The Lycan court," Bess said, not warmly, watchfully. "I am Lottie Varn," Lottie said, before Dominic could speak. "Aldrich Varn was my father." Something moved across Bess's face. Recognition, first, then something more complicated. "Come inside," Bess said. The cottage was warm and smelled of wood smoke and the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. Bess set clay cups on the table and poured from a pitcher and sat across from them with her hands folded, and she told them what the records had confirmed, but had not made human. 3 winters of shortage. Families who had rationed carefully, and then more carefully, and then had stopped being careful because careful was no longer sufficient. 2 children lost in the second winter to a fever that might have been treatable with the resources the provisions were meant to cover. An elder who had not recovered from the cold of the 3rd year. She did not say any of it dramatically. She said it the way people say things they have already finished grieving, plainly, precisely, as permanent record. Lottie listened to all of it without looking away. When Bess finished, the cottage was very quiet, except for the fire. "I am here," Lottie said, "because I intend to ensure that this is formally documented, that the man responsible for diverting those provisions is held accountable under the compact, and that Fenmore receives reparation for what was withheld." She paused. "My father's provision was not optional. It was a debt he considered binding. I consider it binding also." Bess looked at her for a long moment. "Your father was an honorable man." "I know," Lottie said. Her voice held. Bess looked then at Dominic, with that watchful quality still present. "And the court supports this." "The court guarantees it," Dominic said, "under my seal." Bess was quiet for another moment. Then she unfolded her hands and picked up her cup. "Then you had better stay for supper," she said, "and tell me what you need from us to make the documentation complete." They rode back to the court with written testimonies from Fenmore and 2 neighboring villages, each signed by their elders, each detailing 3 years of missing provisions and the specific harms that had followed. Lottie carried them in the leather satchel herself, against her side, through both days of the return journey. On the last evening before the court's ridge came into view, they stopped at a stream to water the horses, and Dominic came to stand beside her at the bank, while the others tended to the animals upstream. The water was very clear and very cold. The last light was sitting horizontally through the pine trees, making everything amber and specific. "When we return," Lottie said, "I want to be present when Gregor is summoned." "You will be." "I don't want to watch from an antechamber." "You will be in the room," he said, "at the council table." She looked at him. "That is not standard." "No," he agreed. "It is not." He looked at the stream. "But you are the injured party, the territorial heir, and the primary witness to the documentary evidence. Your presence at the table is not a concession. It is correct." She was quiet for a moment, watching the water move over the stones. "I have been thinking," she said, About the bond. She said it carefully, the way you say something you have been approaching for a long time from the perimeter. You have not spoken of it. Since Ashenvale. No, he said. Do you? She stopped. Started again. Your wolf. Does it? Yes, he said, simply, without performance. She absorbed this. Since when? Since the corridor, he said, at Ashenvale Keep, when you looked at me and asked whether I meant what I said. She turned to look at him fully. He was looking at the stream, giving her, she understood, the option of this conversation, without the pressure of being watched while she had it. I don't know what I feel, she said honestly. I know that you are. I know that you are not what I expected. I know that I am less afraid in your presence than I have been in most presences. I know that when I said I wanted you to come to the Reaches, it was not strategic. She paused. But I also know that the last time I trusted what I felt, I was standing at an altar in my mother's dress. He turned to look at her then. I am not asking you to trust a feeling, he said. I am asking you to trust evidence. What you have observed. What has and has not happened. A pause. I am aware those are not the same as certainty, but they are more reliable than feeling alone. She held his gaze. The amber light was on his face, and she thought about the letter from her father's housekeeper that Etta had quietly handed her on the second morning at the court. Etta, who had known Aldrich Varn for 20 years, and had been watching Dominic for 10 days, with the careful eyes of someone who had seen a great many men and knew how to tell the difference between performance and character. The letter had said only, "He is the same when you are not watching, my dear. That is the only measure that matters." I know, Lottie said quietly. I know that. She did not say anything else, but she did not look away. Gregor came to the court under summons 12 days later. He arrived expecting, Lottie suspected, a negotiation. He had the bearing of a man who had spent years managing situations through charm and strategic vagueness. And he walked into the council chamber with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to rooms being organized around his comfort. He stopped when he saw Lottie seated at the council table. She watched his face move through several rapid calculations and arrive at nothing useful. Dominic read the charges from the council record in the same even, carrying voice he used for everything. The fraudulent redirection of the northern provisions, the conspiracy with Cole Ashenvale to use the mating ceremony as a mechanism for territorial transfer, the documentation of harm to the families of Fenmore and the neighboring villages. He read it all without theatrical weight, which made it heavier than theater would have. Gregor attempted denial first, then redirection, then an appeal to the complexity of territorial administration that might have worked in a different room with a different audience. It did not work here. Aldrich produced the letter in Cole's handwriting. Gregor's face, when he saw it, went very still. The evidence is complete, Dominic said. The council has reviewed it. The compact is clear. Gregor's eyes moved to Lottie. Something flickered in them. Not remorse, she thought. Calculation. Still. Even now. You would do this to your own family, he said. She had prepared for this. She had sat with it in the evenings and turned it over and understood what it was. A final attempt to make her the agent of something. To relocate the guilt. You are not the family my father intended to leave me with, she said. Her voice was steady and quiet and completely final. You are the man who took what he built and used it for yourself and let children go cold to pay for it. That is what you are. And yes, I would do this. I am doing it. Gregor said nothing after that. The council stripped his administrative authority over the Varn territory that afternoon. The holding reverted, under the compact and with the court's formal endorsement, to Lottie in her own right. Reparation provisions were documented and sealed, to be administered through Aldrich's office directly to the villages. A rider was dispatched to Ashenvale with a formal notice of the compact's findings as they pertained to Cole's participation in the arrangement. Cole sent no response. Lottie had not expected one. Some men, she had learned, were only ever capable of the silence that follows being caught. 3 weeks after the council hearing, on an evening when the first snow of the season had begun to settle on the ridge outside, Lottie sat in the sitting room with the fire burning properly and a cup of Etta's bitter herb tea and the particular quality of quiet that follows the end of a long effort. Dominic knocked. He always knocked, which she had noticed on the first day and had never stopped noticing, and came in when she answered, and sat in the chair across from her with the ease of someone for whom the room had become familiar. They were quiet together for a while, which was its own thing now, a comfortable thing, a chosen thing. Bess sent a letter, Lottie said. From Fenmore. The first reparation payment arrived. She says the mill roof can be repaired before the deep winter. Good. She also sent a jar of something she described as honey preserve, which Etta has already confiscated for what she calls safekeeping. Dominic's expression moved, the real version of the almost smile she had been cataloging since the corridor at Ashenvale, and which she had recently stopped trying to be neutral about. I have something to ask you, he said. She looked at him. I am aware, he said, with the care he gave to words that mattered, that what began between us began in difficult circumstances, that you came here from a morning that had broken something, and that I offered you an arrangement when you had no good alternatives. He held her gaze. I do not want what is between us now to be the continuation of that arrangement. I would like it to be a choice. Made now, with full information, without the morning at Ashenvale as the reason. The fire moved in the hearth. Snow settled silently against the window. I would like to marry you, he said, not because of the compact, not because of the territory, because you are the most clear-eyed, precise, loyal person I have sat across a table from in 11 years of ruling, and because my wolf has known since the corridor what I have been patient enough to let you arrive at in your own time. And because I am better in this room with you in it than I am in any room without you. Lottie looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the corridor, about the wildflowers on the windowsill, about a man who woke before dawn and moved through his practice alone in the gray yard below, about evidence and what it meant to trust it. She thought about her father, who had sheltered families in bad winters and written their names into his will, and told her, once, that the only debts worth honoring were the ones made to people who had never asked for payment. She thought she understood him better now than she had at 8 years old. Yes, she said. It was the same word she had said in the Estalagem common room, and it meant something completely different now. Not a decision made in the ruins of one morning, but a choice made in full daylight, with her father's land restored, her father's debts honored, the people who had wronged her answered, and a man across from her who had not once, in all the time she had been watching, been different when she wasn't looking. Dominic reached across the small distance between their chairs and offered his hand. She took it. His hand was warm. Hers, for the first time in weeks, was not cold. They were married before the winter solstice in the great hall of the Lycan court, with Etta in the front row wearing an expression of comprehensive satisfaction, and Bess of Fenmore seated beside her as a witness. Lottie had sent for her specifically, because some presences were necessary. The binding cord was dark red, as it had always been in the ceremony's tradition, and this time it was placed around joined wrists by an elder who had not been practicing the words in advance of a rejection. The hall smelled of pine boughs and beeswax, and the particular cold and warmth of a stone room in winter with all its fires lit. When Dominic looked at her, steady, gray-eyed, unhurried, she looked back without flinching. Etta lived out her remaining years in the court's household, ruling the kitchens with an authority that Marin eventually stopped contesting and started respecting. The reparations to the northern villages were completed in full within the year. The mill roof at Fenmore was repaired before the deepest snow came. Gregor died 3 years later in the southern holding, stripped of his administrative title, having never publicly acknowledged what he had done. Lottie did not grieve him. She had finished grieving the version of him she had needed him to be a long time before he was gone. Cole Ashenvale was removed from his position as Pack Alpha by his own council the following spring, when the full extent of the compact violation became part of the public record. Lottie heard about this in a letter from Aldrich and set the letter down and did not think about it again. Petra was never mentioned between them. Some things resolve themselves simply by being left behind. The Varn territory thrived under Lottie's administration, connected now to the court's resources and governed with the specific, careful attention of someone who had learned from her father that debts to the vulnerable were not optional and that the names of ordinary families were worth writing down. Lottie was 24 years old when she stood in her mother's dress at an altar that failed her. She was 25 when she understood that what felt like the worst morning of her life had been the last morning of a life that had never quite fit. She did not forget it. She did not need to. It had made her precise and clear-eyed and unwilling to accept a version of love that asked her to be smaller than she was. And on winter evenings in the sitting room on the eastern side of the court, with the pine forest dark and snow-edged through the window, and the fire properly tended and Dominic in the chair across from hers, she was not smaller than she was. She was, at last, exactly herself. And that was where the story ended. Not with a battle, not with a dramatic pronouncement, but with a woman who had been discarded in her mother's dress on a morning in autumn, and who had built, from the ruins of that morning, a life so solid and true and fully her own that no one would ever again mistake her for something temporary.